Hey everybody, Zach here again, back in the contemplation corner. Um, got my books laid out all over the place. Half a cup of tea that's cold and left over from who knows whenever when I was upstairs last. But I had a little thought today that I wanted to share. Of course, it's Saturday. Um, as we remember back through the timeline of what happened with Jesus during the Holy Week, there's just absolutely no doubt at all that at this time on Saturday afternoon, he was dead and buried behind a huge stone. And uh, there's a couple things that I was thinking about. I wanted to go back and look just to think over again what was going on in the disciples' minds during that time, from the time that Jesus died until the time that they had realized that he was brought back from the dead, that he had resurrected. What is it that they were doing? And here's what we get in Luke chapter 22, verses 55 and 56. Now the women who had come with him out of Galilee followed after and saw the tomb and how his body was laid. And they returned and prepared spices and perfumes. And on the Sabbath day they rested according to the commandment. That is all. Of all four Gospels, out of all of the stories from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that is what we have about what Jesus' followers were doing between the time that he died and the time that they realized he had been raised from the dead. Some of them helped bury him in the tomb, right? We know about Joseph of Arimathea. We know about John tells us a little story about Nicodemus being involved in that point. We know that John is floating around a little bit here and there. The women go to find out where Jesus is going to be buried. But from the time that he's buried until the time that the women go back to check the tomb to bring the spices, the only thing that we know that his followers did was that some of the women were preparing spices. That is all. And I think the reason that that's all there is because they had absolutely lost hope. They were completely hopeless. Now there is a little bit more to the story though. We go to Matthew chapter 27, verses 61, 62 through 66. We get this. Now on the next day, which is the one after the day of preparation, the chief priests and Pharisees gathered together with Pilate and said, Sir, we remember that when he was still alive, that deceiver said, After 3 days I'm going to rise again. Therefore give orders for the grave to be made secure until the third day, lest his disciples come and steal him away and say to the people, He has risen from the dead, and the last deception will be worse than the first. So Pilate said to them, You have your guard. Go make it as secure as you know how. So they went and made the grave secure, and along with the guard, they set a seal on the stone. And so what we have is two different groups of people. On this Saturday, as Jesus is in the tomb, he's dead, he's buried, the stone has been rolled in front. You have two different groups of people. One group of people are his followers, people that believed him, the people that loved him, the people that followed him, the people that saw him do miracles, the people who believed what he had to say. They have lost hope. They didn't remember what Jesus had said. Then you have his enemies, right? The Pharisees, the people who had him killed by Pilate and the Roman authorities. They remembered what he said about raising from the dead. So they were going to do everything they could to stop it. So here's what I was thinking about. The disciples on one side had lost hope. The Jews on the other side, the Pharisees at least, had set everything up to make sure that there was no way for Jesus to come back. And yet he did anyway. Both of those things combined, the followers' hopelessness and his enemies' attempts to keep him in the grave, Neither one of those was strong enough to keep him there. Both of those combined were not strong enough to keep him there. God was going to do what God was going to do anyway. And I think that's a pretty powerful thing to think about. When we get into these situations, we put our hope in so many different things, right? We put our hope in our job or our money or our family, or maybe right now we're putting our hope in the fact that someday we're going to get to go out and eat at a restaurant again, and we know that it's on the way. We just don't know when, and so we just sort of day after day keep on hoping and hoping and hoping and knowing that someday it's going to be out there. Maybe things are going to change. Maybe life is going to be different, but at least I'll be able to go out and I'll be able to see everybody, right? And we hang our hope on so many different places besides Jesus. But he is the place that deserves for our hope to be placed. He is the person who pulled it off. He's the Savior. He's the Lord. There's just nothing else to it. And to realize that our hopelessness combined with the enemy's attempts to stop him was still not enough. He fulfilled the promises anyway. I think that's a cool thing to think about. I think it's a good thing to consider moving forward. Those moments when we're hopeless, those moments when it looks like the enemy or a sickness or a loss of a job or whatever else has conspired against us to make sure that God can't do what he said he would do, both of those things combined are not nearly enough to stop him. They're just not nearly enough to stop him. And guys, I hope you've been spending some time this week, these last few days, considering and praying for each other, thinking about what it is that Jesus did, what it is that he's going to continue to do, how different we are because of what happened on that day. And I'll be honest, there's a piece of me that has a really hard time connecting to all of the sorrow of the story at this point, because we already live in the aftermath of the resurrection. I just can't reproduce it all the way. And I don't know if that's really good or bad. I just know that it's how it is. I just know that it's how it is. So, persevere with patience.